this webinar. We're starting 1 minute after the time. Thank you very much for joining us. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Moira Fall. I'm chairing today's panel. I'm the Executive Director of NORRAG, based in Geneva, and currently physically in Geneva as well. And I lead on work with managing the center, and also previously I was the Deputy Director of the Public-Private Partnership Center at the University of Geneva. So really great to have so many of you with us today, and especially knowing that all over the world people are going through very challenging times for many different reasons, particularly those who work in this particular area. Now, before we dive into what you're actually here for, we just need to get through a few housekeeping notes. So you can see on the slide that you have in front of you, apart from the presenters, participant audio and video have been disabled because we do have quite a few participants in this webinar, which is great. And you'll see the questions. You can write a question down using the Q&A function at any time. So if you can't see the Q&A, do make sure that you look for the little box that says Q&A and write any questions that you have for our presenters there. And also the chat box, I've seen several of you writing some messages just to tell us who you are, where you're coming from. It's always very interesting to see that. So this webinar is being recorded, and that recording has already started. Closed captioning is available in English, and again, if you're looking for that, if it hasn't come up automatically, which it has on mine, then look for that little icon that says CC that you can see there on the screen, and turn it off or on. So as far as possible, the presenters will respond to your questions in the Q&A throughout the session, and you'll see in the Q&A box there's one which says open and one which is replied, so you can keep checking back there for questions that have been asked and answered. And then also there will be time at the end of the session to have that discussion and to answer any of those other questions that are that have come up that we haven't been able to address through the course of the presentations. So introducing this virtual CIES panel is really interesting because, as many of you will already know, that we had planned to have these sessions at the CIES conference in April, and unfortunately, due to COVID-19, that was the conference itself was cancelled, but we've moved this onto an online setting, which means the good thing about that is that we get to share this with more people than we would have otherwise. So really exciting webinar on using data to plan for crises. And we have, this is the second in a series of webinars. The first one was held last week on June the 10th, and you can find the video of that up already on the INEE website. And the recording of this one will also be put up in the same place. The third webinar in the series that is also going to be absolutely fascinating is going to take place in 1 week's time again, July the 2nd. And that one is titled Adapting Education Data Systems and Measurements. So here today, we're really looking at using data to plan for these crises. And I'm very excited to introduce our panel to you. We have individuals representing FHI 360, IIEP, and obviously very, very happy to be hosted by INEE as well, alongside the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center that is also based in Geneva here as well. Now, the panel here is really looking to address the issue of the critical lack of data in crises, or the fact that we have an awful lot of data that are inconsistent or do not reflect education. And those challenges really hamper planning and implementation of education service delivery and make it very difficult for children, young people, and returnees to really get to that equitable quality education and learning. And it certainly makes it very difficult for governments and partners to advocate for funding and coordination. And so we have a fabulous panel together today. We have Anne Smiley, who is the Associate Director of Research and Evaluation with FHI 360's Global Education, Employment and Engagement Unit. And she is the technical lead for education and emergencies and leads on all of the monitoring, evaluation, research and data activities for FHI 360's Education and Emergencies program. We also have Christelle, who is the lead researcher at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and she focuses on measuring, understanding, and addressing the socioeconomic impacts of internal displacements, studying the repercussions on livelihoods, housing conditions, education, health, security, social life, and environment. And then from IIEP, we have Claude joining us as well. Claude Ndabananiye, who is a development economist who works in the field of education policy analysis, planning and management. Anne Seeger is a program specialist at UNESCO IIEP, and she provides technical support to countries in preparing crisis-sensitive education sector diagnoses and plans. And she's working right now supporting the government of Iraq developing their 10-year education strategy, as well as teaching at IIEP's advanced training program. Right, so moving swiftly along after all of those introductions, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our first panelist to you. And we have, I think the slides need to move on. Yes, thank you. So Anne, if you would like to switch on your video and audio now, and we'll hear from Anne Smiley, FHI 360, on mapping data use for education and emergencies.
Great, thank you, Moira. Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, wonderful. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today. As you know, I am from FHI 360. I also work really closely with INEE. I am the co-convener of the Data and Evidence Collaborative, and a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today was done in conjunction with my work at FHI 360 and also through INEE. So I'm going to be giving kind of a big picture analysis of how education and emergencies data is used across different agencies and stakeholders and across humanitarian and development actors. And so if you could just switch to the next slide. So what this research that I'm going to be describing to you today falls under is a program called the USAID Middle East Education Research Training and Support Program, or MERS. And it's a 4-year project funded by the Middle East Bureau at USAID and implemented jointly by Social Impact and FHI 360. The objective of the overall mechanism is to support continuous data collection, research, training, and analysis related to education in the Middle East. But specifically, FHI 360 is responsible for task 1, which is really supporting data collection and data analysis and use work related to education and emergencies in the Middle East. So we're specifically looking at Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. If you can go to the next slide, please. As you all know, improving data systems is and has been for the last couple of years, and maybe longer, a major focus for education and emergencies. And I just want to give you a little bit of evidence of that in these icons that you can see in front of you. NORRAG, represented here by Moira, presented a wonderful, or put together a wonderful special issue on data collection and evidence building in education and emergencies. That was about a year or maybe a year and a half ago. Just exactly a year ago, we hosted a data summit on education and emergencies in Geneva that was well attended, and many of you have probably seen the outputs of that. INEE has recently put together a data and statistics collection. There was supposed to be a conference on strengthening EMIS and data for increased resilience to crises with UNESCO, between UNESCO and ECW. It's obviously been postponed. It was supposed to be in April due to COVID. But we're hoping that that will continue. And then just as another example, USAID's learning agenda for education in crisis and conflict includes a whole section on data monitoring and evaluation. So this is a big focus, I think, for our field. If we can go to the next slide, please. So under MERS, we've been tasked with doing a series of research studies focusing in on education and emergencies data. And one of them, the first one that we did, was really mapping education and emergencies data in the Middle East crisis context that I described. And while we did that mapping, we also did an analysis of basically how education and emergency stakeholders understand and make use of data in and for education and emergencies, and looking across humanitarian and development actors. We wanted to understand what makes data useful. We also wanted to get a better grasp, talking to these international actors, on how can our global EIE community come together to improve the use of data to provide accessible and quality education for children and youth affected by emergencies. So this was kind of the overarching research questions that we started with when we started this activity. Next slide, please. So our methodology was qualitative. We talked to a pretty large set of about 45 practitioners and policymakers working in education and emergencies. It was a purposeful sample with some convenience and snowball sampling in there. Again, about 45 semi-structured interviews were conducted, and we did iterative content and thematic analysis. Next slide, please. Our interview respondents are mostly represented by the icons you can see here, the logos, I should say. So we talked to a lot of different organizations, a lot of donors, a lot of implementing partners, and really trying to get a sense across both development partners that work in education and emergencies, as well as humanitarian partners, as well as organizations that kind of span the humanitarian development spectrum. Next slide, please. Okay, so our original data mapping, many of you have probably seen this slide before because we use it often. This is a picture of the differences and similarities across education development data sources and humanitarian education data sources. How do they look different? And this came from the original data mapping that we carried out. And when in that mapping, we really found that there are some really core differences in what the data actually looks like. So educational development data is pretty infrequent. It's usually collected annually or less often than that. There's a relatively stable reference population that we can refer to. There's a focus on the overall education system and the health of that system. There's a pretty clear understanding of what data coverage, reliability, and quality mean. And the data systems, EMIS most of the time, are often owned by the government because this is a, generally speaking, more of a development context scenario. Whereas on the humanitarian side, data, it looks really different. It's much more frequent, often weekly or monthly. There's no stable reference population because people are moving around. And so as a result of that, there's a strong focus on education services provided. And often those services are provided outside of the formal system because of the emergency. There's in EIE spaces or in the humanitarian side kind of not a clear understanding of what data coverage, reliability, and quality mean. There's just a lot more gaps in terms of having a comprehensive, clear understanding of indicators and data quality. And then often the data is set up and data collected by UN or civil society organizations rather than governments. But there's some really interesting overlaps. So we found in the middle there, in the middle of this Venn diagram, that the populations of interest by these different actors in the same space are often the same. So there's everyone wants data on refugees, IDPs, and out-of-school children. And you'll hear education development actors talking about needing data on those populations. And you can also hear humanitarian partners speaking for of the same. And then there's a need for really similar information and indicators across these actors as well. So it seems like the needs are quite similar actually, but the way that data systems are set up and some of the differences between what they look like make it difficult for there to be good interoperability between development and humanitarian actors. Next slide, please. So that was just a little background of kind of the humanitarian development divide and how we see it reflected in data. So this study really focused, as I mentioned, on data use. So let's move into how do actors in EIE use data. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the framework that we came up with. We actually came up with this after a first round of interviews, and then we validated it through a second round of interviews, talking to additional actors and getting their feedback on this framework itself. So we came up with 6 data use categories for how different actors use EIE data. The red ones are more on the operational or program cycle side, and the blue ones are much more strategic and systems level side. So we've got planning uses for understanding the context and needs to design projects. We have monitoring uses for tracking program activities and outputs at the organizational and government levels. We have coordination. That was really important, especially on the humanitarian side, to make sure that activities are aligned and duplication is avoided. Evaluation, of course, to identify outcomes and compare effectiveness and efficiency. And then in the blue, we have these more strategic uses. So policy making, informing the design of new policies of organizations and government, and then also promoting priorities and solutions and fundraising on the advocacy side. So these 6 data uses really encompassed the different types of ways that people, there are different things that people need data for across all the different actors that we talked to. Next slide, please. So across all of the actors, there was a really strong focus on operations and needing data to inform operations for education and emergencies. That was evident across humanitarian and development actors. And there was a clear desire for actionable data to plan and monitor programs. And that actionable data needs a sufficient level of granularity in order to be useful. So here's a couple of quotes from our interviews from our side. We like our data to be used for planning, monitoring, all these different things. At the core of it, it needs to serve operational purposes to respond. Another quote, data in this context is important. It helps inform how we shift or change our environment and how we should be adapting our programming and budget planning. Next slide, please. We also saw large differences in the perspectives of actors by their level. So where we saw, rather than across humanitarian development, there being big differences in how data is needed and used, we found much bigger differences between global and local actors. So at the global level, rather than focusing on operations, they were focusing much more on using data for strategic uses, that advocacy and policymaking and the creation of global public goods. So you can see, I mean, this is probably relatively obvious, but global actors were saying, you know, we're using data to support our advocacy, to rally the international community. We're interested in the wider global public good of having better data on these populations and setting up systems at the country level. And whereas at the local and national level, it was much more about operations. Next slide, please. Another difference was, or a difference, I guess you should say, between humanitarian and development was their reference to global mandates. So development actors focused on the SDGs much more, SDG 4, whereas humanitarian actors were talking a lot more about the grand bargain. And I think that this also shaped how they think about and need and use EIE data. Next slide, please. So what makes data useful to those actors in education and emergencies? What did they find as the key things? Let's go to the next slide, please. So we found that context really matters in terms of what characteristics of data are more or less useful. So obviously more volatile situations need more frequent data. And so this could mean biweekly, and that could be, biweekly or monthly for humanitarian actors. Development actors, when they think of frequent data, might mean quarterly or annual data. But certainly the more volatile the situation, the more data frequency, the higher data frequency is needed. Also, the data, as I mentioned earlier, for operational purposes needs to be more granular than what's needed for advocacy or policymaking purposes, because it's needed to actually make decisions much more at that local planning level. Next slide, please. So additionally, it's much more than numbers. It's not purely technical when we think about what's useful or what's important for data use and usefulness. So we found 3 additional non-technical factors that shape how people think about data use and usefulness: the political context, networks and relationships, and institutions, including capacity, mandates, norms, and institutional cultures. So I'll talk about each of those briefly if we go to the next slide, please. So data is often politicized. Again, I'm sure this is not a surprise to many people on the call. But there is it's common for powerful actors to not want attention directed to certain areas or aspects of education, or to redirect using data. Humanitarian actors may not be able to share data because of conflict sensitivities, or data analyses may be affected by political agendas. We heard quotes like, "The ministry would change the numbers to make them look worse before funding, or better, depending on the situation." And when data isn't there, it's often not by accident. Next slide, please. We also heard people saying a lot that data sharing relies on relationships. Relationships facilitate the ability and speed with which practitioners can access data, and shared data and analysis can strengthen cluster relationships, for example, by showing added value, creating a virtuous circle of data sharing. A quote here was, "To get people to participate in clusters, you have to show them participation will result in something of value. So giving information is one way to get partners to show up, attend meetings, and share information." Next slide. And then we have institutions, and the big picture here was really about capacity and the importance of capacity building. So respondents talked about how we do need to institutionalize and standardize methods, tools, and indicators to facilitate improved data use, but this is really determined and mediated by institutional capacity. So just as an example, we heard that only 31% of clusters have an information manager at present, and that was a gap that was identified by respondents. When discussing capacity building, the key capacities that were consistently mentioned were how to find and use existing data, how to collect better and more standardized data, and how to link data sets and analyze it jointly, and to look at that interoperability. Next slide. So I think I'm just about out of time. So just a couple final minutes. Where do we go from here, and what steps can the global community take? Next slide. So clearly, we found that there is no single technical solution. We have to really think about who are the end users of data and the institutions in which they work. But we do think it's going to be important going forward for the community to convene stakeholders around a new way of working in EIE data that cuts across humanitarian and development sectors and articulates the different types of data that are needed for different uses and contexts, regardless of agency or mandate, working on this idea of building towards collective outcomes. Third, we need to start from our shared uses and move towards a modular but more standardized and shared data ecosystem that enables smarter links between operational data and longer-term data. Next slide, I think we're just about at the end. Here are some activities that are currently going on to try to move forward on some of these data use next steps. So we hosted through INEE and MERS some capacity building webinars on EIE data. That was through the INEE Data and Evidence Collaborative. Those are available on INEE's website. We also are forming under the INEE Data and Evidence Collaborative an EIE data reference group to really work on some of these issues and start to produce global guidance around EIE data. INEE is going to be starting to produce a new quarterly data and evidence newsletter to share resources and start to bring actors together around some of these initiatives. And then, just so you all know, USAID MERS, the project that I work on, has produced some EIE data tip sheets to help practitioners find, interpret, and use EIE data. All right, I think next slide. Thank you so much, everyone. It's really been a pleasure, and I'll hand it back to Moira.
Thank you for that, Annie. Very, very interesting. And asking that question about what data and evidence counts for whom and at which level, and for whom is it relevant at different levels. So our next speaker, Christelle Casaba, from the internal displacement, oh, I've lost it, sorry, is going to talk to us about internal displacement's impacts on education, new findings for Africa. And this was a question that came up in the webinar last week, which shows the melding together of some of the themes that we're talking about here. Christelle.
Thank you, Moira. I hope you can all hear me okay?
Yes, just fine, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about one of the groups of people who are impacted by crisis, who receive less attention and less support. And these are internally displaced people, or IDPs. An example of that is that, as you all know, we had 2 global compacts, one on refugees and one on migrants, and no global compact on internal displacement, although we have twice as many IDPs worldwide as the number of refugees. Being internally displaced means that you're forced to leave your home because of conflict or violence or disasters, but you remain within the borders of your own country. And being internally displaced also means that you will often feel a degradation of livelihood, housing conditions, security, social life, health, and education. And of course, today I will focus on the impacts of internal displacement on education of children in Africa, but all these impacts are often interlinked. Next slide, please. Thank you. In 2019, the number of people living in internal displacement because of conflicts or violence around the world was the highest ever recorded, with 45.7 million people. And another 5 million were internally displaced because of disasters. This map shows you that conflict-related displacement is very high in Latin America and in the Middle East, of course, but it is actually highest in Sub-Saharan Africa, which represents 42% of the global total number of IDPs. Next slide, please. Knowing the edge of IDPs is not easy. Only 14% of the countries and territories on the map you just saw publish information on the age of their IDPs. But using national demographic distribution data, we were able to estimate that a total of 21.3 million IDPs were under the age of 18 in 2019. We also estimate that approximately 12 million children worldwide are between the ages of 5 and 14 and living in internal displacement. And this corresponds in many countries to primary and lower secondary school age. Next slide, please. This figure just illustrates in orange the proportion of children of different age groups who was living in internal displacement at the end of 2019 because of conflict or violence, and in blue because of disasters. Whether they were displaced by one or the other cause, actually, the impacts of displacement on their education are often similar, but we will get to this in a minute. Next slide, please. So next week, we will release more detailed information about the impacts of internal displacement on the education of children in Africa as a background paper to UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report. But this map already gives you an idea of their distribution and the countries where we find the highest numbers. There were over 1 million children of primary and lower secondary school age whose education was affected by internal displacement in each of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan. Next slide, please. Internal displacement has different consequences for IDPs of different age and gender, socioeconomic status, abilities, ethnicities, and so on. But many of these consequences are recurring. This graph shows, for instance, how internal displacement can force people to move away from schools and into areas where there are no schools. This is one of the most straightforward and frequent barriers to education for IDPs. But this is a rather complicated and dry graph, I must admit, and I drew it myself. So I prefer to tell you 3 short stories to illustrate how displacement can impact children's education. Next slide, please. On the right, the little boy looking at you is Obaid. He's 11 years old, and he was displaced by conflict in Yemen and does not go to school because some schools have been bombed and others are used to shelter displaced families like his. In addition, he spends his days with his little brother collecting plastic bottles and selling them for recycling to help support his family whose income was lost because of displacement and the war. And these are true stories. The little girl in the middle came with her family from rural Somalia to find refuge in Mogadishu. Her family were pastoralists, but because of the drought in recent years, they had to leave their lifestyle behind and move to the city. Back home, neither she nor her brother would go to school. The school was too far away for a little girl to go on her own, and her brother was busy keeping the herd. Since the move to the capital, they have access to free educational facilities that are run by NGOs in the settlement where they live. Her brother can now go because he no longer has to keep the herd, but she still does not. Although access to education is free now, there are other costs like buying supplies that her family can only afford for one, now that they have no other source of income. As many families faced with that decision in Somalia, they send their boy to school before their girl. And the last story is of the little boy on the left, Simon, who is 11 like Obaid. He lives in a displacement camp in South Sudan, where a school has been set up and provides free education to all the children in the camp. And he's doing so well in school that he now helps his father learn how to read and write. Now, these 3 stories are intended to make the following points. Not all internally displaced children experience displacement the same way. For this little girl's brother, it actually led to a better access to education, but not for her. So gender considerations, amongst other things, are useful to plan for better support. This also shows that we need not only quantitative data on the number of IDPs of school age, but also more in-depth information to understand the often complex mechanisms through which displacement impacts education. And the differences between Obaid and Simon, both 11 and both displaced by conflict in war-torn countries, also show that adequate educational support can make all the difference in their current and their future lives. Next slide, please. Now back to the data. This graph shows you that in these 13 African countries affected by displacement crisis in 2018, not all internally displaced children were included in humanitarian response plans. In red, we show here the proportion of children not included, perhaps because they were in areas that the aid providers could not access. Next slide, please. But as you all know here, it is not enough to be included in planning. The plan then needs to be funded. Only 32% of the educational section of humanitarian response plans in sub-Saharan Africa, on average, are eventually funded. So if you take funding into account, this is the result, with in red, internally displaced children not receiving educational support in these African countries. Next slide, please. This figure sums these results up. For sub-Saharan Africa, only 21% of the children internally displaced and in need of educational support, in green here, receive it. All the others, representing 3 million children in light and dark gray, are excluded from educational support and therefore at risk of being out of school. Next slide, please. This last slide serves as a disclaimer that the figures I presented are underestimated because not all IDPs are accounted for to begin with. Some are hiding and do not want to be reported as IDPs, do not want to be registered anywhere for security reasons. Others never appear in any registries because perhaps they moved very slowly after a few droughts happened and not all at once. And we know that small-scale events are much less often reported. Sometimes we get information in the media of a few dozens or a few hundred people moving, but not always. There are also difficulties, as you're aware, accessing conflict or disaster-affected areas to account for these people. And in addition to these difficulties, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center that is responsible for the collection of and the publication of data at the global level on internal displacement does not access all existing reports. We have limited capacities and there are some reports that we cannot access, sometimes because they're not published online or they're in a language that we do not work with. So that's another limitation. And added to that, we do not publish all the data that we access. Sometimes, if we are unsure about the quality of the data or how up-to-date it is, then we choose not to publish it. So we always prefer to publish underestimates rather than overestimates when we have to make that decision. Another important point here is that the number of children in displaced populations is higher than in the national population, actually not the number, but the proportion, and especially for internally displaced populations. So when we use national demographic distribution data, like I have, to estimate the number of internally displaced children, this leads to, again, an underestimation. Therefore, planning better educational support for internally displaced children requires, well, more accurate estimates than the ones you've seen here, but also disaggregation of these figures by sex and age and disability and language and more characteristics that can be relevant. And we also need information on the resources that are accessible to children for education in their area of refuge, as well as the specific barriers they face, because these vary from one context to the next. So with this, I think I'm about reaching the time. And so the final slide, please. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christelle, for that fascinating talk, really showing us how IDPs are an exemplar of what Annie talked about in terms of the politics of data. And it's not just a technical question, and also for really showing us the humanity behind those numbers. So now we're going to pass on to Claude Ndabananiye, who is going to talk to us about using data to plan for education in emergencies and how IEP is working to support ministries of education doing that. Claude.
I was on mute. Hi, can you hear me?
Thank you. Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think, yeah, I'm going to try to turn things around and approach the issues around EIE data from the government perspective, mainly from our support to ministries of education in different countries, and how, what IEP is doing to address the issues colleagues just mentioned around EIE data and really our support and our proposal. Next slide, please. So as some of you may know, so IIP is the International Institute for Education and Planning. It's an institute of UNESCO, and our mission is to strengthen capacity of countries to plan and manage the education systems. So this is done through several activities that are organized around 3 core blocks, namely technical cooperation, training, and research. So IIP, as part of these activities, IIP has been supporting for a very long time countries to improve or upgrade or really strengthen their capacity in terms of statistical capacities. And also as part of that, next slide please, as part of that, IIP also has been also supporting a number of countries in what we call crisis sensitive planning, which is a really a special support we conduct in countries that are either faced with crisis or countries that are trying to strengthen their planning strategies, but also capacities for implementation to be able to mitigate or prevent a crisis. And as you can see, that the typical cycle of education planning is around the sector analysis, policy formulation, costing the strategies, but also the designing an EMIS framework. And crisis sensitive planning is about, for each step of this planning cycle, to be really able to integrate aspects related to disaster risk reductions in terms of situation analysis, but also when it's time to design policies and programmatic responses to be assured that as part of those strategies, disaster risk reduction are fully integrated as part of the response. Next slide, please. So what I want to share with you today is to give you a quick overview of, as I said earlier, of what IIP is doing in supporting the Ministry of Education address the different issues we have now regarding EIE data. So as I said before, we all agree that there is a huge lack of quality data, if we may say so. Quality meaning that we have, in some cases, really no data at all, or in other cases we have a lot of data but that are incoherent in many ways because of issues with methodology, the frequency of data collection, etc. So looking from that perspective, we try to come up with a proposal, and I'm building on what Hans Meili presented, these 2 diagrams putting together development data and the humanitarian data. And these, we are in the first diagram for development data that are really less frequent and not fit for the purpose, because we know that Ministry of Education, the way that what we call EMIS or EMIS, these data systems at country level, they were not originally designed to collect EI data, meaning that EI data being that data that are very frequent, but also data that are related to specific groups that are not necessary in easily not isolated, meaning that Ministry of Education that are used to collect data, for instance, from schools, like public administration. And when, for instance, for the case of IDPs or refugees, because also for sometimes issues around mandate, Ministry of Education are not always to go into refugee camps, for instance. In that case, it becomes very complicated to access schools that are in these camps. But of course, generalizing the situations may change from country to country. So the key point here is that EMIS at the beginning, they were not designed to collect this EI data. And as a solution, as a result, sorry, please, next slide, please. As a result, we've seen that when there is a crisis, of course, it makes sense that humanitarian actors, they will jump in and try to do whatever they can to be able to have data for many purposes, whether it's for planning for recovery or budgeting and reporting. And we really, from the government perspective, it's really a relief when there is this type of support. But you can imagine in the long term how governments, the issue of strengthening capacity of governments being able to, okay, during a crisis may make sense that things are done in a certain way, but in the long term, then what can we do, and what can be done to make sure that government data systems are strengthened and capacitated to be able to really collect and produce and publish these EA data. So I think we going to have less issues trying to convince people now that we have this health crisis that showed everyone that there is a need for data that are reliable, of quality, that are timely, etc. So now in the past it was not the case, but I hope that things are changing. So what we are really trying to do is address the issues from the government perspective, making sure that EMIS data systems are upgraded and are strengthened in the different categories related to EMIS, and that in the future we make sure that EMIS are able to be up to the task. Next slide, please. So I'm going to use the remaining time to give you an application of what we did in Burkina Faso and what we intend to do or we are doing in many other countries, using the case of Burkina Faso. So some of you know Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has been dealing with security issues since a couple of years now. A lot of regions in the north are faced with terrorist attack, and when there is a terrorist attack in one region, so people are going to be fleeing their homes and trying to find a more secure place to stay. So meaning that schools are going to be closed, and for instance, that you can see that the number of IDPs over the last 3 years have moved from something around 17,000 to the last number we have was in March this year, up to something around 800,000. So really an explosion of IDPs. And as a typical African countries, Burkina Faso, the biggest share of those numbers are children of school age. And so the issue at that time was that the government, the Ministry of Education EMIS system was really not equipped to collect data needed to be able to say how many IDPs do we have, how many of them are in need of education services, where are they, etc. So the job, next slide, please. The support was provided by a group of humanitarians that try to propose whatever they could, and there was also a government body that was collecting data on IDPs, but for education purposes, data on education is the case in many countries. Data on education was really very aggregated, and you could hardly know how many children do we have from primary school age, etc. So that's where we came in, and we've been supporting Burkina to improve data collection, but not only with the Ministry of Education, but also with these different partners working in Burkina. Next slide, please. And so in addition to security issues in Burkina, Burkina also is a Sahel country, meaning that they are faced with a big number of many other crises, including epidemics and but also floods, droughts, and many others. Many other aspects. So while the focus for many data collection, either for the by the Ministry of Education or by the partners, was focusing on security issues, mainly IDPs, but we had also many other issues around the other hazard I just mentioned. So the idea behind was really, how do we upgrade the data collection system so as it collects data needed for planning, but also data that are really available when we need them. Next slide, please. So the approach was to build from what the existing data collection tools. This is a situation we had a year ago, roughly, where the Ministry of Education had 5 data collection tools, meaning systems, internal systems. Some of them collecting data on annual basis. This is the typical annual census that is used for annual abstracts, but also a lot of more or less bigger data collection focusing on issues related, for instance, to closed school, open school, or needs assessments, etc. So a lot of really a lot of small data collection, but also managed by different entities within the ministry. On top of that, we had also other government bodies that were collecting data, mainly the CONASUR, which is the government body in charge of humanitarian affairs. They were collecting data on IDPs, but on a general purpose, including on issues beyond education. But also we had a lot of data collection being done by donors and other partners, mainly the UNHCR that collect data on refugees, but also different partners doing needs assessment data collection. So this was the situation back then. And what we with the support, of course, of different all of these partners involved, we came to a, next slide please, we came to a new design of the tools, and of course all the implication in terms of technical architecture, of redesigning at the ministry level, redesigning the annual data collection and making sure that new EIE data needs that are not needed on a more frequent basis could be added on the annual census. We are here talking about beta data on on school infrastructure, whether schools have walls, windows, whether schools located in a certain region subject to heavy winds are capable of resisting such shocks, etc. But also the box in the middle was the new tools, 2 new tools that were designed and maintained by the Ministry of Education. And one of the tools is going to be the use of that tool. I have already started. It's going to be a monthly data collection that is tracking the school closure and the school reopening, but also IDPs who are in need of education services. And then a quarterly data collection tool that is used to track the progress, because there is a strategy for EIE that is trying that is aligned with, along with the MNE framework of the strategy, and with the intention of monitoring the progress. And then this is the last box. This is something that is ongoing, because you can say that because of the issue of the mandate, but also mission, etc. The CONASUR, the government body in charge of humanitarian affairs, and the UNHCR, etc., and other partners, we agreed that they're going to harmonize their questionnaires and the data sharing protocols between them, so that, for instance, the Ministry of Education cannot or has not to go collect data that is already available within another organization, as long as they agree on a predefined questionnaire to use and the frequency, etc. So regardless of the structure collecting the data, they can all of them have access and use the same data. So this is the structure now. And we are still in the middle of strengthening and institutionalizing the support, because this is where things can break or be successful. Because, next slide, please. Because of course, as I don't remember who said that, probably Ismaili, the issue around EiE data is not mainly a NIT or technical problem. It's mostly around people collecting the data and using the data, but also the entire system around that. I'm talking about rules and the regulations, whether the services in charge of data collection are adequately funded. This is a huge problem in many countries where you have an EMIS department, but they do not have any means. And you can understand that they are reluctant at taking on additional tasks when there is a situation they have to go and collect data on IDP, etc. They do not have means to cover logistical costs, and they will easily pass on that. And also a lot of capacity building that is needed. And speaking about capacity building, that's also one area where I see the contribution of the global actors having a bigger impact, not mainly in terms of methodologies that are, need to be harmonized and also diffused largely, and also specialized training on data use, data collection, data use that need to be strengthened. I think that was my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claude, for that really interesting presentation on how important the appropriate governance of the evidence base is, and the support that IEP is giving to governments to be able to do that. So after those fascinating presentations, I'm going to pass over to Anna Seeger now, who's going to give us some thoughts on those presentations and other ideas, and then moderate the Q&A as well. Anna.
Thank you very much, Moira. Can you hear me well?
Yes, that's
okay,
great.
Good. So I'm really pleased. Thank you. I'm pleased to be here today, and very much enjoyed the three presentations. Thank you so much to the presenters. In a couple of minutes, we'll start a round of Q&A. So dear participants, please leave your questions or comments or reflections in the Q&A chat. And I think some of you have already, I can see 2 open questions. That's amazing. Those of you who haven't seen the Q&A chat yet, it should be somewhere down in the left hand corner somewhere. So if you like, you can ask direct questions to the presenters or more general questions related to the topic. So to give you a little bit of time to write down your comments and questions, and perhaps some additional food of thought, I'd like to highlight a few findings from those 3 presentations. So we heard from Anne, from Christelle and Claude, very strong arguments for why data that looks at the effects of crisis on education is key. And I think there was a shared understanding that this sort of data can provide evidence on the effects of crisis on education that are direly needed to develop sound and articulated education policies and sector plans, but also programs, which are then needed to guide long-term recovery efforts. And of course, which are basis for advocating for funding. and reminded us that, of course, if we want to report on SDG indicators, we need to have better EiE data. And I think the MEARS project is really interesting. It provides a very unique and excellent overview of how EiE data is used by different stakeholders for both strategic but also for operational purposes across the humanitarian and development fields. And I really enjoy reading the overall approach, but also I've used actually some of the results of that research for 2 countries in my own work, and I think it's very rich. So then Christelle's presentation showed the need to fill a rather blatant data gap, how crises impact on IDP's access to quality education and the costs associated with missing out on education. And I think that the data that IDMC produces reminds us that we just cannot afford to close our eyes, when it comes to internal displacement, because the costs are simply too high. But also, I think she said that solutions that do not include vulnerable populations such as IDPs are simply not durable and are not sustainable. So Claude, the last presentation from Claude helped us then switching perspectives and taking on, as he said, a government perspective. And we learned about the challenges that Burkina Faso faced with an EMIS that just wasn't prepared for crises such as displacement and insecurity, and how they managed to overcome those challenges through a 3-step process, basically remodeling the national education data system to integrate crisis-specific data for policy making and planning. So a little bit of a different perspective that looks at concrete data use for policy making. And I just wanted to mention perhaps 2 key issues that really stuck out to me. The first issue is about institutional capacity. And I think that within humanitarian as well as development-oriented institutions, and here I'll talk about governments as well as partners, institutional capacity is a vital factor for ensuring good quality EiE data and the effective use of it. So we heard from the 3 presenters about issues like the lack of data culture, issues around, or the facts where countries have actually rich data that is just not used, either because data is uncodified or stored in inaccessible formats, or also not universally not comparable, which is difficult. But also what Claude mentioned for Burkina Faso is the issue around data sharing. If there are no protocols around data sharing, then all that data is just not useful. So the question is here really for all of us, how can we collectively work towards strengthen capacities to produce but also to harvest EiE data for better policy making and for better planning? And the next issue I wanted to highlight is, because it touches upon the complexity of working in crisis contexts, is the politicization of data in crisis settings, both around the production of data and the data use. And Annie showed this really excellent quote that said, when data isn't there, it's often not an accident. And I thought this was quite helpful to remind us that EiE is not just a technical exercise. It requires a comprehensive understanding of societies, of communities, history, politics, social fabric, and so on. And to better understand the complexity of crisis effects in education, we may have to widen our horizon when it comes to the political economy of data production and the use for policy making and planning. And I think there's still a long way to go for us. So last but not least, I think global policy visions such as the SDGs, the Agenda for Humanity and so on, have clearly provided a momentum for, as Annie put it, a new way of working in EiE data, towards collective outcomes, especially around standardized and shared data ecosystems. And I believe that the results from the MEARS project that Annie presented, the IDMC research that Christelle presented, and IEP's applied crisis data use for policy making and planning that Claude had presented on, are really just the beginning of that new way of working. And these experiences help us, the global and local humanitarian, but also development communities, to get a better understanding of where we're coming from, where we are right now, and where we want to go, when it comes to data production and use on the effects of crisis on education. So I'll stop here, and I see that we have 5 questions, which is lovely. So I would perhaps start with the first one. Tageya, I think from Ethiopia, mentioned, what about the lack of education management structures at lower levels regarding EIE data? So can I ask perhaps Claude to take this question on?
Hi again. So I think I'm not sure I have an answer to that, and I would like to just to share that from a government perspective, in EMIS, it's a really complex data system, and it follows the structure of the administrative division, meaning that we have a central department coordinating the data collection, but also you have an equivalent at each level of government. Don't know which country the answer is referring to, but in cases where I've been to or we've been supporting, we don't have this issue of not having education management structure at lower levels of government. But one thing I would like to highlight, and this is something we've been seeing in people working in this field, for a typical Ministry of Education, their counterpart for data collection is in many cases the school, the director of a school. And in the time of crisis, mostly that, for instance, in Burkina, when there is a terrorist attack, the school is closed, so there is no person to speak to. So we've been looking at alternative ways of reaching out to either to a director wherever he is, because sometimes he has moved to really very away compared to the school, but also to other local authorities we may get our hand to for data collection, because you want to make sure that you cross also the information, because in this case, there is an issue of reliability. You need to make sure that if there is a school that is supposed to be closed or destroyed, etc., you need to call a few people to make that this is really the case, also assess the impact. So the structure from my experience, I haven't seen this issue of not having someone to speak to in terms of administrative structure, but also there is a way to find alternative the focal point for data collection at all levels of government. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Claude. I hope this clarifies your question. There are a number of questions, so I have to make a hard decision on which one we can pursue. I think we have a good 20 minutes, so I think we can go through a number of questions. I think there is a question specifically for Anne. Why do you divide? Well, let me perhaps, Anne, if you don't mind, if you could respond to this question directly in the chat. I think perhaps that is easier. I was wondering whether perhaps there's a question perhaps for Christelle. Christelle, if you could take on this question, that would be great. The question comes from Therese Marie. It's about incorporating or taking into account the culture of IDP children. Any thoughts on this? So she's coming from the Philippines, a place known for its diversity and conflicts, and she's wondering whether these aspects have been explored for, I assume, for data collection and use, and what are the implications or findings? Over to you, Christelle.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I'll be happy to try to answer this very good and difficult question. Just noted that I was also trying to answer in writing one of the questions, and then the question just popped away into the answered box, which does not mean by any means that I answered it entirely. So perhaps you want to take a look at those, because maybe others will want to say something about it too. But regarding the question on taking into account the culture of the children, first of all, the research program on the education of internally displaced children is very young. It's about 1 year old. So we have not yet had the chance to work in the Philippines. So I can't speak to the specific context, although it is very possible that we will in the next 2 years. But one other example perhaps that I can give is that we've been faced with some children who were unable to access the school in their area of refuge, even though the school was free and they were able to go and it was relatively easily accessible and so on. But one of the reasons was that the teachers were not speaking their language that they spoke in their area of origin. So that was one language barrier. But there was also another issue with internally displaced children not being able to afford the uniforms that they needed to wear in school. And therefore, the school system thought it best to allow these children to just come to school without the uniforms. And that sounds like a good idea. But actually, it was really hard for these children to accept that, because then they would have to go to school without the uniform, whereas the non-displaced children would be wearing the uniform. And for them, it was really hard to be seen as, to be categorized as IDP children because they couldn't afford the uniform. So it seemed like a good solution, even though there were aspects beyond what we would think are the most straightforward barriers, such as access, such as cost, such as right to go to school, that we must take into account. And these can be psychological consequences, cultural aspects that may mean that a child will not even go to school if they feel that it is not, it puts them at a shame to go in such conditions. So this kind of information, however, is very hard to collect in a consistent way across different settings, because as you raise very rightly, it differs so much from one country to the next, but also within one country, that for us, the only way to get this kind of information and do something about it is to conduct this kind of much more in-depth focused research programs and data collection exercises, such as the one that I was just mentioning here. But yeah, it's really hard to draw broader conclusions on this kind of aspects, and it really requires specific data collection and analysis, and then support, obviously.
Great, thank you, Christelle. It is it's a tricky question. So I hope that it answered your question, and I think we would move on to the next one. So, okay, the issue is that if there's a response, then okay, that's what you said, Christelle, then the question jumps into the answered box. Okay, I actually wanted to go back to one question that is, and I wanted to see whether Anne perhaps wants to provide an example. The question is from Emily Vargas-Baron, and it's about, she wants some concrete examples on how data analysis and reports have been used effectively for policy, for planning and program improvement or expansion. And we have one response from Christelle already. I think that is helpful. And do you want to add perhaps your experience?
Sure. Yeah, I think that when we have frequent data coming in on the reach of our programs and the extent to which the conflict context or the emergency context is shifting and changing, we're able to make decisions as programs and as any whatever level of actor it is, whether it's at the program level or at the government level, about what service provision is going to be required to address those changing conditions. So we did have an example of that from a program where I work on in Northeast Nigeria, in which one of the areas where we were working, providing services to out-of-school children through non-formal learning centers, through our data collection mechanism for the program, which is also run through the government, we found that there were actually, the context had changed enough that there were actually not any more children, or not very many children, that were out of school for us to be focusing on. And we were actually, through our non-formal education system, potentially drawing kids out of the formal system into our non-formal system, into our non-formal centers, which is obviously not the point. So we're able to use the data that was coming in through the system to work with the government to make a decision to change the location where we were working and mitigate that potential problem of drawing kids out of the formal system. So that's one kind of concrete example. We're working right now with LGA, or local government authority actors in Nigeria, this is in Borno and Yobe states, to actually build those district level or LGA level data hubs to bring all of the data into these dashboards that are offline operational at the district level, so that they can use the data. And we're going to be training them to use the data to make these kinds of decisions about where to focus, where to focus resources, where to focus different kinds of activities, and that kind of thing. So that's another example. I do work a lot in Nigeria, so that's why my examples are both from there. I hope that's helpful.
May I add something on that?
That would be great.
Along the project I just was result I just shared with you in Burkina Faso, the data support was conducted also in parallel to an additional support we were providing to the government, where they were designing a national strategy for education emergency. At the beginning, they had a strategy that only focused on a few areas that were hit by the terrorist attack, but when they designed the strategy, that was only a few regions, but in a matter of a few months, the terrorist attack spread to more regions. So they wanted to update their national strategy for EIE. And then our support was really to do that. And so the data we collected was not used for instance, for analysis, situation analysis. We relied more on data we could get our hand on from international sources as HDX or also local partners. But the data we supported collecting through the example I shared was the basis for the monitoring and evaluation of the strategy. As I said, they are collecting now twice a month data on schools that are closed, schools that are open, but also they are collecting data every 3 months on following the M&E framework of that strategies. So this is something concrete on how data can be really used to either conduct a thorough situation analysis, but also inform decisions in also the programming or monitoring of the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claude. I hope this was helpful. I would like to continue with a question from Hiroko about the importance of data and info sharing, and it's something that all three presenters highlighted. So she's asking, or he, I'm sorry, but are there any risks in sharing data among different institutions, for example, misuse of data, or how can we reduce these risks? A very important question. And who of the three presenters would like to answer this question with a concrete example, perhaps?
I could give a few answers on that. Or Annie, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, well, let me just first of all start by saying that INEE is actually working on putting together a, I can't remember if it's a white paper or a guidance document, basically on research or on ethics rather for EIE data to try to really get at some of these issues around the risks of sharing data and how we can potentially mitigate some of those risks. So we're going to be working on that over the next few months and sharing that out through INEE. So yes, there are risks. I think that's absolutely true. So if the other two want to talk a little bit more about what those might be, that would be great.
I'm fine. That was what I want to say as well. So at least if the person has needs more additional.
I can say just a couple of words. Oh, Anna, you're muted.
Yes, I was wondering, Christelle, because I think you could probably provide some really interesting experience, because when it comes to IDP data, information is, key, and of course can be misused also by governments, especially, when politics, insecurity, and so on are the reason for displacement. Please enlighten us.
Absolutely. So actually, when it comes to data that's already out there, first of all, there's very little on the education of internally displaced children, and when it is included in EMIS, then we very rarely have it disaggregated by displacement status. So, but when it comes to the data that we have started collecting, and again, I'll stress we actually don't collect that much data. Most of the work that we do with secondary data. but we have begun collecting data in some tense areas or areas with political sensitivity. So of course, the thing that we do and that everybody does in this context is to entirely anonymize the information to the point that I don't even have access to any identification information. We make it clear in the terms of reference with the people we work with that we don't ever want to have access to this information as to their names, any information that could help identify them. Of course, we have a broad idea of the location where they are, but that's about it. So when it comes to children in particular, we do not engage directly with the children, we engage with their parents. So there's another ethical point here that should be raised, and that is taken very carefully by our organization. So as for the sharing of the information that we collect, we do make it available to selected partners. For instance, we've shared it with UNICEF, but we don't make it publicly available on our website. We have data available on our website, but not this one. And we share it again in a completely anonymized way, and most of the time also in an aggregated status, so that really there is no risk when it comes to the security of the people. We also only work, and that is a good thing, but it can also be a limitation. We only work in areas where we have, of course, the approval of the national authorities and the government and the research authorities in the country. So that means sometimes we don't get access to areas we'd like to go to, but also that means that generally where we do get to collect primary data, it's relatively okay with the government. I hope that's useful.
Great. Thank you very much, Christelle. I'd like to go back to an earlier question from Anne-Marie Thompson on formative versus summative assessment. I think very interesting. Anne-Marie is working in DRC, and she highlights the issue around getting good data on student learning. And so she's saying that her primary focus is on formative assessment, simply because gathering high quality summative assessment has been really impossible. She's saying that the challenge is that there is so much data because of the frequency of data collection, for example, teacher-student self-reflections, but the analysis becomes overwhelming. So she would like to know your thoughts on formative versus summative assessment in education in emergencies. It's a very tricky question. Who has an idea and perhaps wants to share some experiences from your practice?
I can talk about it a little just to start. I do a lot of both formative and summative assessments in our programs as well. And I think that both are extremely important. So when we can't do high quality summative impact evaluations or other kinds of outcomes evaluations, it is particularly useful to have really good formative data. And so the challenge that you've identified there is the sort of volume of data, and especially when we integrate it into the intervention itself, which we often do in our programs, as you're saying, teacher-student self-reflection type data, is really great at that granular local level between the teacher and the student, but may not be as easy to figure out what you do with it as you aggregate it up. So I think that in my experience, the trick is figuring out what data actually does need to flow up, and maybe not all of it does, and maybe there's just one or two data points from each of those interactions between student and teacher that actually needs to flow up and go into that higher level analysis. Whereas, most of it probably can just stay at that level of work, between the teacher and the student, or between the observer and the teacher, or whatever the particular relationship is. And then, obviously figuring out how do you streamline these assessments overall so that we're reducing participant burden, which is always challenging. So there's no simple answer, just in terms of trying to structure it as well as possible so that it's really clear that every data point has a purpose, that we're going to use it for something. We're not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. A lot harder than it sounds, I know. That's what I would say. You're on mute, Anna.
Yeah, I know. Will we ever get there? So I think there's one specific question from Emily Vargas in relation to effective national M&E frameworks, EMIS and EIE systems, and asking about recommendations. I was wondering whether perhaps we could postpone that, Emily, if you agree, because next week there will be another webinar organized by INEE, and we will share the links to that webinar in due time, and that will particularly discuss experiences around beefing up EMIS systems, similar to Claude had explained for Burkina Faso, and perhaps there will be some further insights on what sort of elements make EMIS systems effective in crisis situations. Okay, she's saying great, wonderful. Oh, I love this. Okay, I would like to take on another question from Luke Pai. He's saying it would be good to hear. Oh no, it moved. Where did it move? Here. It would be good to hear thoughts and examples of more collaborative or co-designed EIE data collection and usage, or interesting usages of existing data. From his research at UNESCO, he's seeing signs of data fatigue, particularly among local data collectors. He's saying it's very common to see data go up the data chain, but never come back down to more decentralized decision makers. Interesting and important observation, I think. Who would like to respond to this? Perhaps Claude to start with.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have a more recent example on that, but also I would just would like to emphasize on that from our experience in Burkina Faso and also in Ethiopia. What we've seen is that when there is no harmonized data collection among the government and these different other actors, there is a really duplication, this is for sure, but also what Luke called data fatigue, because in many cases we are relying on the same focal point for data collections. It's either headmasters of a typical school, but also these local actors on whom we are relying for data collection. So you can imagine that the Ministry of Education will send a questionnaire for data collection. A week after, it's going to be another government body, and the week after, it's going to be a humanitarian actor requesting the same data. So why not don't we harmonize data collection, and we use, because we are really collecting the same information. So just emphasize that. And in Burkina, as I said, what we did, a big deal of data collection, mostly those that are really collected at school level. It was agreed that the ministry will be in charge of that. And then all data that is either in refugee camps or IDP camps will be managed by UNHCR or the government body in charge of humanitarian affairs. But they agreed on a set of data collection tools to make sure that when one of those three collects data, it's shared with the other two, and there is less duplication. I don't want to say there won't be any, but at least they're going to be very limited duplication in terms of the collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. I think it's we're almost 1 minute before the end of this webinar. There's still a couple of open questions. One comment from Emily I wanted to mention, because she's saying it's very important to begin to document these, impact policy level and also program level, of course. The impact, how data, EIE data, can be used for policy making. And only if, I agree with Emily, only if we can show how data is being used and how this data usage is making a difference in terms of, minimizing the risks for children when it comes to insecurity, or, addressing the effects of conflict and crisis in and through education. And I think that many organizations and governments are working towards this, and I think INEE is a good place come to read up on these findings. So I think then I think the protocol is also that if for remaining questions or open questions, we answer them in writing, if I'm not mistaken. So I would hand over or hand back to Moira, and I would like to thank everyone, the participants, for very interesting, very important questions, and to the presenters for giving great responses. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, all I can do is add my thanks to Anna's. That was a truly fascinating hour and a half. Just very quickly, the panel next week is going to be just as interesting. You've got the link in the chat box now, or you can find it on the website. In the panel next week, we've got FHI 360, NYU, UNESCO, the Global Education Cluster, Education Cannot Wait Fund, examining how education data systems and measurements, both national and humanitarian, can be adapted to improve the quality, interoperability, availability, and accessibility of education data. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you also to all of our panels today, and look forward to seeing you at the same time next week at the next webinar. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.